Joseph Beyrle jumped into the dark sky over Normandy, not knowing that ahead of him lay captivity, torture, daring escapes, and an alliance with the Red Army. He would become the only American to have officially fought both under the Stars and Stripes and under the Red Banner. Dear friends, right from which corner of the world you are listening to us, support the story with a like and enjoy your listening. The darkness above the French coast seemed endless, and only rare flashes of searchlights cut through the heavy air, echoing in the heart with anxious tremors. Joseph sat on the hard bench inside the roaring transport plane and felt every vibration of the metal, every breath of the engines. Behind his back was the heavy parachute, his weapon tied to his legs, and all of it felt like an unbearable burden, yet far heavier were the thoughts circling in his mind. Ahead, awaited land filled with dangers, and no one knew whether he would ever return. The plane flew low, so low it sometimes seemed the wings would brush the treetops. His ears rang from the drone of the propellers. His heart beat so strongly it seemed ready to burst out and drown the sound of the motors. Joseph felt the tension of his comrades sitting nearby. No one spoke a word, but all understood that this very night would mark the point from which the liberation of Europe would begin. When the green light came on, the world seemed to break apart. One after another the soldiers stood up, and Joseph, trying not to think, followed them. The cold stream of air struck his face and tore away his breath. For a moment he felt as if falling into emptiness, the earth beneath him gone. Then came the sharp jolt. The parachute opened, and the white canopy blossomed above his head. The night smelled of smoke and sea. Below were faint village lights. Occasional gunfire shattered the silence, reminding everyone this was no training jump. Joseph looked around and saw a few more canopies gliding nearby. Yet many soldiers had been blown far off course by the wind. They were scattered across the countryside, and contact with each other was lost with every minute. The landing was rough. Joseph hit the tall grass hard, nearly twisting his ankle. Quickly he freed himself from the straps and listened. Around him it was quiet. Only distant artillery thundered. He knew he had to find his men, otherwise the jump would end in vain. Gritting his teeth, he rose and moved forward, carefully testing each step. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making the darkness even denser. At one point he thought he heard voices. Joseph froze, his heart pounding like mad. It was the Germans. Their footsteps drew nearer, and he pressed himself into the ground, his face against the damp grass. Shadows passed by, and only when the sound of boots faded did he dare lift his head again. To him it felt like an eternity, though in truth only minutes had passed. Moving further, he finally noticed a familiar silhouette. One of his comrades waved a hand, giving a sign. There were only 3 of them left. From an entire unit remained just a tiny handful of men. But there was no turning back. Each had orders to destroy enemy communications, cut supply lines, do everything so the landing on the beach would succeed. They moved along a country road, every sound louder than it truly was. Somewhere nearby a dog barked, and the bark carried through the night as if the entire village had learned of intruders. Joseph felt sweat on his palms, but held his weapon tightly. Each step brought them closer to the unknown. The first mission was simple only in words. They had to blow up a bridge the Germans used to move equipment. The explosives were carried with them. When they reached the target, Joseph helped to set the charges. All was done in grave silence. Only breathing, only trembling hands, only the thought that a mistake would cost their lives. The bridge exploded into the air with a roar that seemed to shake the whole countryside. A second of silence, and then sirens, shouts, gunfire. The Germans had spotted them. They had to run into the darkness, weave across fields, fall into ditches, and hear bullets whistling overhead. In such moments, a man understands his life hangs by a thread, and chance alone can cut it. Joseph felt exhaustion, his legs heavy in the mud, yet within burned a sense of importance. He knew every step, every breath. This night would be written in history. Europe awaited them, the world awaited them, and he, a young man from an American farm, was here for a reason. That night, he felt for the first time the real taste of war. Not training, not veteran stories, but reality, where the ground shook with explosions, where death hid in every shadow. And he accepted this challenge. His fear, stretched to the limit, turned into strength, pushed him forward, forced him to believe survival was possible, that this jump into the night would mark the beginning of a great journey. The night after the landing stretched endlessly, as if time itself slowed down in the French countryside. Joseph moved cautiously along the hedgerows, his boots heavy with mud, the sound of distant explosions echoing across the fields. He was no longer simply a paratrooper. He was a ghost wandering the enemy's backyard, unseen, yet dangerously close to being discovered at any moment. The three men who had found one another after the drop clung together. They whispered their plan in hurried gestures, knowing that words carried too far in the silent night. Their orders were clear: disrupt the Germans, weaken their grip, and create chaos so that the soldiers storming the beaches could push inland with less resistance. Yet orders written on paper were nothing compared to the reality of fear and fatigue pressing down on their shoulders. They came upon a narrow dirt road where the enemy moved supplies. Joseph knelt in the tall grass and watched as a column of trucks rattled by, headlights dimmed, soldiers slouched against their rifles. He gripped his weapon, feeling the temptation to open fire, but discipline held him back. 3 men against dozens would be suicide. They needed sabotage, not a futile blaze of bullets. At dawn they slipped into a small hamlet. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, roosters crowed, and the world seemed deceptively peaceful. Yet the streets were patrolled, and signs of occupation were everywhere. Joseph felt his stomach tighten as he saw a villager step aside, bowing his head in silence as German boots trampled the cobblestones. The war had turned homes into prisons, and every glance from the locals carried a quiet plea for salvation. That morning the Americans struck for the first time. In a barn on the edge of the village, they discovered fuel barrels stacked high, guarded only by a single inattentive soldier. The guard never had the chance to react. In a flash, he was silenced, and the explosives were set. Joseph held his breath as they slipped away into the hedges. Moments later, the sky tore apart with fire. Flames roared into the heavens, black smoke curling above the rooftops. The ground shook, and birds screamed into the sky. For the first time, Joseph tasted the power of disruption. The Germans shouted in confusion, rushing toward the inferno, leaving gaps in their watch. But victories in the enemy rear were never without cost. By midday, German patrols combed the fields more aggressively. Joseph and his companions were hunted animals darting from hedgerow to hedgerow, every rustle of leaves threatening to give them away. Hunger gnawed at them, thirst dried their throats, but adrenaline kept them alive. As night returned, they stumbled upon a bridge where armored vehicles were expected to cross. The three men crawled beneath its wooden frame, fingers shaking as they fixed the charges. Every creak of the planks above them made their hearts race. They prayed the enemy would not notice. When the final wire was secured, they crawled out and waited in silence. Hours passed like years. Then came the growl of engines. Tanks rolled forward, heavy and unstoppable, symbols of German strength. And in that instant, the bridge exploded beneath them. Metal screamed, water boiled with fire, and the mighty machines tumbled into chaos. The blast drew fury like a storm. Searchlights swept across the countryside. Gunfire crackled in every direction. Joseph and his comrades ran with every ounce of strength left in their bodies, pursued by shadows and bullets. They collapsed finally in a ditch, mud swallowing them as they lay motionless, gasping for breath, praying not to be seen. That night, Joseph realized that life behind the enemy lines was not only about missions, it was about surviving each heartbeat. He understood that every action they took, each bridge destroyed, each depot burned, was a ripple pushing the tide toward freedom. But he also felt the weight of how fragile they were. Three men in a sea of enemies, surviving only by luck and the darkness that cloaked them. The first battles in the enemy rear taught him more than any training ever could. This was no longer strategy drawn on maps. This was the raw edge of war, where courage was tested not in glory, but in silence, in mud, in the breath held while death walked just above your hiding place. And Joseph, though young and exhausted, found in himself the strength to keep moving forward, deeper into danger, carrying the hope of liberation in every trembling step. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows like a shroud, and Joseph felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at his every step. 2 nights of fighting, of running, of hiding from searchlights and dogs had drained him to the bone. He and his remaining companions moved through the fields like shadows, hoping to reach the safety of another farmhouse, perhaps to find bread or a sip of water. Yet in the enemy's land there was no safety, only temporary shelters that turned into cages the moment boots approached. The trap was waiting. It came not with thunder, but with silence. A sudden crack of twigs, the click of a rifle bolt, and the air froze. Out of the trees emerged gray uniforms, rifles leveled, eyes cold and calculating. The Germans had learned quickly. They knew where the paratroopers might hide, and they tightened their net with ruthless patience. Joseph's heart pounded as he glanced at his comrades. They were surrounded, outnumbered by more than 10 to 1. For a moment, he considered raising his weapon. His finger brushed the trigger. The image of a desperate last stand flickered in his mind. But the odds were merciless. A burst of fire would end them all in seconds, their mission erased, their lives wasted. Slowly, with bitterness burning in his chest, Joseph lowered his rifle. The others followed, their hands raised as German voices barked commands. They were stripped of weapons and marched down the road with bayonets at their backs. Villagers peeked from doorways, eyes filled with pity and fear, watching the defeated liberators push through their streets. Joseph kept his head high, even as dirt and stones were thrown by collaborators who jeered at the captives. Pride was all he had left, and even in chains he clung to it. The march ended at a makeshift holding pen, where dozens of captured soldiers sat in silence, faces gaunt and pale. Some were wounded, bandages already soaked through. Others stared blankly at the ground, broken by fatigue. Joseph joined them, feeling the sting of failure but refusing to let despair take root. He reminded himself that war was larger than one man, larger even than one battle. The fight would go on, with or without him. When night fell, the guards dragged the captives to a rail yard. Cattle cars waited, their doors gaping open like mouths, ready to swallow lives whole. The prisoners were crammed inside, packed shoulder to shoulder, the stench of sweat and fear thick in the air. The doors slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. Only slivers of moonlight cut through the cracks in the wooden boards. The train jolted forward, and with every turn of the wheels, Joseph felt himself carried deeper into the enemy's world. The rattle of iron, the groans of the men, the occasional cry of pain became the rhythm of captivity. Days blurred together. Hunger gnawed like a beast. Thirst scorched his throat, and the cold nights bit into his bones. Yet through it all, he clung to one thought. He had not come this far to vanish behind barbed wire. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the doors slid open to reveal the looming fences of a prisoner camp. Towers rose above them, machine guns glinting in the light. Barbed wire coiled in endless rows, a cage built to crush hope. As he stumbled out under the gaze of his captors, Joseph understood the reality. He was no longer a soldier on the battlefield. He was prey inside the cage of the Wehrmacht. But even as the gates clanged shut behind him, a spark burned within. Chains could bind his body, but not his will. Somewhere beyond these fences lay freedom, and Joseph vowed in silence that he would find it, no matter the cost. The gates loomed tall and merciless, their iron bars crowned with spirals of barbed wire that glistened like fangs in the pale light of dawn. Joseph staggered through them with the other prisoners, his body aching from days in the cattle car, his stomach hollow, his throat raw. The smell hit him first, a stench of sweat, sickness, and despair, heavy in the air like a fog that never lifted. The camp was not simply a prison. It was a machine built to grind men into dust. The guards barked orders, their rifles slung carelessly yet ready to strike. Dogs strained against leashes, teeth bared, growling as if they too were hungry for flesh. Prisoners already inside watched the new arrivals with eyes dulled by suffering. Some looked away, too broken to care. Others stared with hollow curiosity, as if trying to remember what it felt like to be new, to still believe escape might be possible. The first days blurred into a rhythm of cruelty. At dawn, the men were driven from their bunks, thin planks barely wide enough to lie upon. Roll calls dragged on for hours in the cold, the guards counting and recounting, beating any who faltered. Food came in the form of watery soup and scraps of bread so small they seemed like mockery. Thirst was constant, and water was dirtied, rationed, given only enough to prolong survival. Work followed. Endless labor meant to exhaust, to strip away strength. Men hauled logs, dug trenches, carried stones until their hands bled and their backs bent under the weight. If someone collapsed, he was kicked, beaten, sometimes shot before the eyes of the others. The message was clear. You are not men here. You are numbers, shadows, expendable pieces in a game you cannot win. Joseph felt the despair pressing in, whispering that resistance was useless, that he was just one more soldier swallowed by the maw of war. Yet He refused to surrender to that whisper. He watched the guards, memorizing their routines, noting where shadows fell across the fences at night. He studied the locks on the gates, the timing of the patrols, the dog's restlessness. Each observation was a spark of defiance, a reminder that captivity was not the end. At night, in the barracks, he listened to the quiet murmur of fellow prisoners, stories of families, of farms, of lives left behind floated in the darkness. Some men wept silently, their spirits breaking under the weight of endless days. Others clenched their fists, whispering prayers or promises of revenge. Joseph lay awake, staring into the shadows, and made his vow again and again. This cage would not hold him forever. But the camp did its work well. Weeks inside its walls felt like years. Hunger carved lines into faces, sickness spread like wildfire, and every day the roll call was shorter. Men disappeared, swallowed by labor, by punishment, by despair. The iron gates did not need to stay locked to hold a man prisoner. Often the chains that bound strongest were inside the mind. Joseph understood this truth as he watched companions crumble. He saw men who had once jumped into battle with fearless hearts reduced to trembling shells, and he knew that if he let the camp claim his spirit, his body would soon follow. So he clung to every fragment of hope, every memory of freedom, every vision of home. He built a fortress within himself, a place no guard could reach, no fence could bar. The iron gates stood tall, unyielding, but Joseph swore they would not be the end of his story. They would be the beginning of the fight for his soul, and one day, the beginning of his escape. The nights in the camp were long and cruel, filled with the groans of the sick and the hollow coughs of men whose bodies had given up. Yet, for Joseph, the night was not only torment, it was also the hour of possibility. Beyond the fences lay the fields of France, the villages, the forests that could hide him, the path back to the fight. The thought of freedom never let him sleep, and so his eyes scanned the camp even when darkness swallowed it whole. He had watched the guards for weeks, learning the rhythm of their steps, the moments when their attention faltered, the times when the dogs dozed. He knew the weak spots in the wire, where rust bit into the iron, where shadows from the towers left blind corners. Every detail was a thread, and Joseph was weaving them into a rope that might pull him beyond captivity. The night of his attempt came with a heavy fog. The mist rolled low over the ground, blurring the outlines of the barracks and softening the light from the towers. It was a night when even the searchlights seemed weaker, their beams scattering into pale ghosts. Joseph felt his heart hammering in his chest as he slipped from his bunk and crawled silently across the dirt floor, careful not to wake the others. Some men stirred, but none spoke. Perhaps they guessed. Perhaps they had once dreamed the same dream. At the fence, he pressed himself against the earth, listening. The guard's boots scraped the gravel, then grew distant. The dog yawned, stretched, then settled again. Joseph's hands found the wire. The barbs bit into his flesh, slicing the skin, but he forced himself to climb, the pain swallowed by urgency. The wire snagged his clothing, tore at his arms. Yet he pulled, pushed, clawed his way upward. The taste of blood filled his mouth as he bit back a cry. He dropped to the other side, the damp grass muffling his fall. For a heartbeat, he lay still, every nerve on fire, listening for an alarm. None came. The fog wrapped him like a cloak, and he began to crawl toward the fields, the damp earth clinging to his hands and knees. Every sound, the flap of a bird's wings, the creak of a branch, made his muscles tense, expecting a shout, a shot, the howl of dogs. But the silence held. He reached a hedgerow and dared to breathe deeper, his lungs aching with relief. Freedom tasted like wet soil and cold mist. For the first time since his capture, he felt the weight of the fences behind him, the air untainted by despair. He rose to his feet and began to run, stumbling through the darkness, not caring where the road led, only that it was away from the camp. For 2 days he moved through fields and forests, hiding by day and creeping forward at night. Hunger gnawed at him. Thirst dried his lips until they cracked, yet the fire in his chest carried him forward. He saw villages in the distance, lights flickering in windows, but dared not approach. The enemy's reach stretched far, and one wrong step could undo everything. On the 3rd day he felt it, the net tightening. Voices carried on the wind, shouts in German, the barking of dogs. Panic surged as he stumbled through the undergrowth, branches clawing at his face. He ran until his legs betrayed him, until he fell, gasping, into the mud. Hands seized him, rough and merciless, dragging him to his feet. The dogs snarled inches from his throat, their eyes burning with hunger. The guards laughed, their rifles pressed against his back. Joseph's first attempt at freedom ended with chains heavier than before. He was beaten, his wounds reopened, and he was thrown back into the camp as a warning to the others. The message was clear. Escape was not only forbidden, it was punished. But even as he lay in the darkness of the barracks, bruised and broken, Joseph's spirit did not yield. He had touched freedom, felt it in his lungs, tasted it in the air of the fields. And once a man has known that taste, no wall, no wire, no punishment can erase it. The first attempt had failed, but deep inside he knew it would not be the last. The beating he endured after his capture was not meant only to wound his body. It was meant to carve fear into his soul, to show him and every prisoner that escape was an illusion. The guards made sure his bruises spoke louder than their words. Yet Joseph, though bloodied, held to a single truth. He had crossed the wire once, and he would try again. The Germans sensed this flame and decided to extinguish it with a weapon far crueler than barbed wire. They sent him into the hands of the Gestapo. The journey from the camp to the gray buildings of the secret police was a descent into another kind of darkness. Here there were no rules of war, no pretense of order. Here men disappeared into shadows and returned only as whispers among the living. The halls smelled of damp stone, sweat, and fear. Cells lined the corridors, their doors heavy with bolts, their silence pierced only by the occasional cry of someone breaking under torture. Joseph was thrown into a room lit by a single bulb that swung overhead. The walls were bare, yet the menace came not from the emptiness, but from the men who entered. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces hard, their eyes cold. They asked questions, always the same, about codes, about units, about secret missions. When his answers did not satisfy, fists and boots did the talking. Hours blurred into agony. They wanted to break him not only for information, but for control. They wanted him to fear escape, to accept captivity as his fate. But Joseph clenched his teeth, swallowed his cries, and clung to the thought that pain was temporary, That freedom was worth more than the comfort of surrender. Every strike he endured was another vow carved into his soul. One night, after endless interrogations, he was dragged through the corridors past cells where men whispered prayers in languages from across occupied Europe. Some voices were broken, others still defiant. He realized he was not alone. This place was filled with fighters, each carrying their own spark of resistance. The Gestapo could cage them, could torture them, but could not erase the truth that men still chose to resist. Days turned into weeks, or perhaps it was less, for time inside those walls lost all meaning. He lived in a haze of hunger and pain, the scraping of boots in the hall his only measure of passing hours. Yet even in this pit, Joseph found his will unbroken. He thought of the fields of Normandy, of the comrades who still fought, of the mission larger than himself. They could not make him betray that mission, no matter the price. At last, he was deemed useless to them. He was battered but silent. His body carried the scars of their attempts, but his mind remained a fortress they could not breach. The Gestapo returned him to the prisoner system, certain that his spirit had been shattered, that he would no longer dare to seek freedom. But Joseph knew something they did not. The price of failure was high, yes, but it had not killed him, and every man who survives the hunt of the Gestapo walks away changed. Pain had sharpened his resolve, and the iron they had tried to force into his soul had only hardened his will. He had touched despair and returned alive, and that meant he was still capable of trying again. The hunt of the Gestapo had left him scarred, but it also left him fearless. He no longer feared the price of failure, for he had paid it and endured. Now he carried within him something stronger than fear, something that would drive him to seek freedom once more, even if it cost him everything. The wounds of the Gestapo had barely begun to fade when Joseph once again felt the hunger for freedom rising inside him. He was back among other prisoners, in a camp where the days stretched endlessly, marked only by the whistle of the guards and the clang of metal gates. Many around him had given up. They shuffled through the routine of captivity, their eyes empty, their spirits broken. But Joseph could not accept that fate. He was a paratrooper, a man trained to fight behind enemy lines. To live without trying to escape felt worse than death. This time he moved carefully, studying every detail of the camp. He counted the guards on each shift, memorized the moments when their attention wandered, and noted the weak spots in the barbed wire. He listened to the whispers of other prisoners, sharing ideas, testing who could be trusted. A plan began to form, not bold and reckless like the first attempt, but precise, sharpened by experience. One cold night, under a thin moon that hid behind drifting clouds, he made his move. With a small group of fellow prisoners, he slipped through the shadows. Their breaths were shallow, hearts racing, every crunch of gravel beneath their feet sounding louder than cannon fire. They reached the wire. With hands torn by rust and frost, they pried it open just enough to crawl through. Freedom lay just beyond. For a moment, Joseph felt the intoxicating taste of hope again, the thrill of beating the impossible. He thought of the forests, of finding partisans, of making his way back to the fight. But fate had other plans. A sudden flare burst above the camp, bathing the ground in white light. Shouts followed, the barking of dogs, the thundering of boots. The escapees scattered, but there was no place to hide. Joseph ran until his lungs burned, But the sound of hounds grew closer. The weight of a rifle butt struck his back, throwing him into the mud. Rough hands dragged him up, iron chains clamped around his wrists. The second attempt was over. Once more he stood in captivity, his body bound, but his will not yet broken. The guards laughed as they paraded him back through the gates. They wanted the others to see, to understand that resistance was futile. Chains rattled with every step he took, cutting into his skin, but Joseph held his head high. They could shackle his arms, but not his spirit. Back in his cell, he lay on the cold floor, the sting of failure pressing down heavier than the chains themselves. Yet, even in that darkness, he whispered to himself a vow. If he was alive, he would try again, because every chain, no matter how strong, rusts with time, and every prisoner who still dreams of freedom is already halfway there. The transport rattled across occupied Poland, its iron wheels grinding against frozen rails. Inside the cattle cars, the air was foul and stifling. Dozens of prisoners were pressed together so tightly that they could barely sit. Joseph leaned against the wooden wall, feeling every jolt of the train in his bones. Days blurred into nights without food or water, only the muffled sobs of men who once believed themselves soldiers, now reduced to shadows. When at last the train screeched to a halt, the doors clanged open, and the prisoners spilled out into a world of snow, barking dogs, and shouting guards. Ahead loomed the barbed wire of yet another camp. Guard towers rose above it like skeletons, their searchlights sweeping the compound. This was Poland, the land of villages already scarred by occupation and war. But for Joseph, it became a new prison where every ounce of hope was tested. They called it a labor camp, but its reality was slower and crueler than a battlefield. Prisoners marched to back-breaking work at dawn and returned only after darkness, stumbling on frozen mud. The weak collapsed by the roadside and never rose again. The barracks stank of sweat, sickness, and despair. Lice crawled in the straw where men tried to sleep, gnawing at their skin through the night. Hunger hollowed their faces, and coughs echoed like a grim chorus. The guards knew that starvation could break even the strongest, so they rationed food so thin that survival became a lottery. A ladle of watery soup, a crust of bread as hard as stone. This was all that sustained them. Joseph felt his body growing weaker, but his spirit clung to defiance. He listened to the whispers of other prisoners. Many were Poles, captured partisans, who had seen their families burned out of villages. They spoke of home with voices that trembled, but also of resistance. To them, Joseph was an odd figure, an American who had dropped from the skies into their ruined land. Some distrusted him, but others saw in his eyes the same fire that still flickered in theirs. The days dragged on. Snow melted into spring, but the camp did not change. Men disappeared every week, some taken away for punishment, others too frail to rise from the straw in the morning. Their names faded quickly, like smoke in the wind. It was a place designed not only to kill but to erase, to swallow men so completely that the world would forget they had ever existed. Joseph fought against that fate. He forced himself to remember names, to carve them silently into his memory, so that at least someone would carry them forward. At night he lay awake, staring at the beams above his head, the stench of damp wood heavy in his nostrils. Hope seemed to vanish here, like water dripping into sand. But he refused to surrender completely. Somewhere beyond the wires, he believed there were still free men fighting, still armies marching, and if there was war still raging, then there was still a chance, no matter how small, that he could break these chains again. In the silence of that Polish camp, Joseph whispered the same words he had spoken after each failed escape. As long as I breathe, I am not defeated. The days in the Polish camp had settled into a rhythm of despair until the sky itself broke the silence. One gray morning, the distant hum of engines rolled in like thunder. Prisoners paused in their labor, lifting hollow eyes toward the heavens. At first, the guards barked orders, forcing them back to work, but the sound grew louder, an unmistakable roar of Allied bombers slicing through the clouds. Joseph felt his heart pound. He knew that sound better than most. He had once been part of that vast aerial armada. The air shook as bombs whistled down. Explosions tore the earth apart, flinging soil, wood, and shards of metal in every direction. The camp convulsed in chaos. Towers collapsed. Barracks splintered. Men screamed. Prisoners and guards alike scattered, seeking cover where none existed. Through the smoke and fire, Joseph saw something else, the chance he had been waiting for. The outer fence lay shredded, ripped open by a blast. Sparks danced on the torn wire, but beyond it stretched freedom, hidden in the haze of destruction. He did not hesitate. With a shout to those nearby, he darted toward the gap. Some followed, stumbling over the ruins, others too terrified to move. The air was thick with dust and cordite. Sirens wailed, dogs barked frantically, and the guttural cries of guards trying to restore order pierced the roar of the bombers. Joseph sprinted, legs burning, lungs aching. A comrade fell beside him, struck by shrapnel, but there was no time to stop. The earth erupted again, and just behind him, the blast lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the mud. His ears rang, but his body still obeyed the desperate call of survival. He crawled, then staggered upright, slipping through the twisted gap in the wire. Each step felt unreal, like running through a nightmare. Behind him, the camp still writhed in fire and confusion. Ahead lay fields scarred by craters, and beyond them, forests, dark, uncertain, but free of chains. He plunged toward the trees, the pounding of his heart louder than the explosions fading in the distance. In that moment, Joseph knew the bombing was not just destruction, it was deliverance. What for the guards was terror, for him became salvation. He did not look back at the prison that had tried to break him. He would carry its shadows forever. But now the road lay open once more. He had escaped the jaws of hell. The forest swallowed Joseph whole. Branches whipped at his face. Roots clawed at his boots. But he ran as if the trees themselves urged him forward. Behind him still echoed the thunder of bombs, though now more distant, muffled by layers of earth and pine. Every breath he drew scraped his throat raw, but each gasp also carried the taste of freedom. The camp was gone, reduced to rubble and smoke. He was alive. But freedom in war-torn Poland was fragile, a thin line drawn in blood. Joseph knew this well. Alone, half-starved, his uniform in tatters, he was as vulnerable as a hunted animal. The Germans would comb the countryside. The Gestapo would send patrols, dogs, and even bribe villagers with promises of food or protection. His very survival depended on remaining unseen, unheard, a shadow drifting eastward. The East, how strange it felt to think of it as salvation. For any American soldier, the natural thought was to head west, back toward France, toward the beaches of Normandy, toward the armies, wearing the same flag on their shoulders. But Joseph was no ordinary soldier anymore. Twice captured, twice chained, twice humiliated, he had been spit out by fate into a no-man's land where the only safe path lay not homeward, but deeper into the unknown. East meant Russia. East meant the Red Army. He had heard stories in the camp, how the Soviets were relentless, how they drove the Germans back inch by inch, turning villages into fortresses and rivers into battle lines. He had also heard whispers of their ruthlessness, of men shot for hesitation, of officers who trusted no one. But Joseph had little choice. In the West lay only death, camps, firing squads, the Gestapo's endless hunt. In the East, there was at least a chance, however uncertain, to fight again. Days turned into a blur of trudging through mud and fields. He scavenged what he could. From abandoned farmhouses, he found crusts of bread so hard they cracked his teeth, jars of cloudy pickles, a potato or two left behind in the dirt. Once he stumbled across a half-burned barn where a cow, forgotten in the chaos, still lingered. He drank its warm milk straight from a tin can and wept, because for the first time in months, his stomach felt full. Nights were the worst. The cold cut deep, and fear gnawed deeper still. He could never build a fire, for smoke would betray him. Instead, he curled beneath fallen branches, wrapping himself in stolen sacks, shivering until dawn. He dreamed of home, Michigan fields, the laughter of his brothers, the smell of bread from his mother's kitchen. But when he woke, all that remained was silence and frost. Then came the villagers. Not all were enemies, though fear made them cautious. In one hamlet, Joseph approached an old woman tending chickens. She froze when she saw him, her eyes widening at the sight of his ragged uniform. He tried broken words, German, a few phrases of Polish picked up from fellow prisoners, anything to bridge the gap. She understood enough. With trembling hands, she pressed a piece of bread into his palm and crossed herself, as if warding off evil. He whispered a hoarse thank you and vanished before neighbors could betray him. At times, though, he was not so lucky. Once, crossing a wide road at dusk, headlights flared. A German patrol car screeched to a halt. Joseph hurled himself into the ditch as shouts erupted. Bullets tore the earth around him. He crawled through mud until his hands were raw, then sprinted through a field of rye, his heart hammering like a drum. The chase lasted hours, but by some miracle, the soldiers gave up. Alone in the dark, soaked in sweat and blood, Joseph laughed bitterly. He had cheated death once more. Step by step, mile by mile, he pressed east. The land itself told a story of war. Burned villages with blackened chimneys stabbed the sky. Abandoned trenches snaked across meadows filled with stagnant water. Corpses lay where they had fallen months before, bones gnawed clean by time. And yet life clung stubbornly too. Children peeked from behind fences. Women drew water from wells. Partisans scrawled messages on barn doors warning of ambushes. At last, after weeks of wandering, Joseph reached the forest where the German presence thinned and the air seemed different, charged, expectant. Rumors whispered among peasants grew louder. The Red Army was near. Tanks rolled somewhere just beyond the horizon. Artillery thundered like distant storms. The front line was shifting, grinding east and west like two giant gears locked in endless struggle. Joseph stood on a ridge one evening and gazed toward the glow of battle on the horizon. The sky pulsed with red and orange, the reflection of burning villages and exploding shells. It was the glow of the future, terrible yet promising. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of his journey behind him and the uncertainty ahead. Would the Soviets see him as an ally or a spy? Would they even believe his story? The road east was more than geography. It was a march into fate, into the arms of strangers who might become brothers in arms or executioners. But Joseph knew only one truth. He would rather risk death fighting than rot in chains again. With that conviction burning in his chest, he set his course firmly toward the rising guns of the Red Army. And so the paratrooper from America, hardened by captivity, hunger, and despair, walked eastward into the heart of a foreign war, unaware that destiny had chosen him for a place no other American would ever occupy. The forests of eastern Poland grew thicker, darker, almost endless. Joseph moved through them like a ghost, cautious with every step, ears tuned to the faintest sound. Days stretched into weeks, and the land around him changed. The language spoken in the villages shifted. The German patrols grew fewer, and everywhere he began to notice the signs of a different presence. Artillery tracks in the mud, empty ration tins stamped with Cyrillic letters, graffiti painted on barn walls with slogans he could not fully read, but somehow understood. Death to the invaders. One morning, after a night of restless sleep under the crooked roof of a half-burned chapel, Joseph woke to silence so deep it made his chest tighten. Then he heard it, the rumble of engines, heavy, steady, unhurried. Not the whining roar of German trucks, but something deeper, like the growl of beasts made of iron. He climbed a small ridge, belly to the earth, and froze. Below stretched a column of tanks and soldiers, their uniforms dark, their helmets round and unfamiliar, their banners crimson, the Red Army. The men walked with rifles slung, weary but purposeful, their breath steaming in the cold morning. Joseph's heart pounded. He had reached them at last. But with relief came dread. How could he approach them? To the Soviets, he was a man in rags, speaking foreign words, possibly a spy. An American soldier appearing alone in the middle of war-torn Poland sounded less like truth and more like a Gestapo trick. He remembered stories told in whispers by prisoners that the Soviets shot first and asked questions later. Joseph stood, raising both hands high, clutching the remains of his torn uniform to show its insignia. He stepped out from behind the trees and stumbled into the clearing. Shouts rang out immediately. Dozens of rifles snapped up, barrels glinting in the sun. A voice barked orders in Russian, sharp and commanding. Joseph froze, hands trembling above his head. "I am American," he cried in broken Russian he had pieced together in camps. "Amerikansky soldat, paratrooper Ali," his voice cracked from exhaustion, but desperation gave it strength. The soldiers advanced cautiously, boots crunching in the frost. One young soldier, barely more than a boy, stared at the foreigner with wide eyes, whispering something Joseph could not catch. An officer pushed forward, tall, square-shouldered, his pistol drawn. He barked a question Joseph could not understand. Joseph repeated again and again, "American, paratrooper. Normandy, prisoner." At last, a translator appeared, a man with a thick accent who knew a little English. "Who are you?" "Why, here," he demanded. Joseph's words spilled out like a flood. He spoke of D-Day, of capture, of camps, of escapes, of the bombing that gave him freedom. He told them how he had walked east because it was the only path left. The translator relayed his words, and murmurs rippled through the ranks. The officer studied Joseph for a long moment, his eyes cold, his fingers still near the trigger. Finally, he lowered his pistol. A curt order followed, and the soldiers closed in, surrounding Joseph. They did not embrace him, did not smile, but they did not shoot. They led him into their column, a foreign figure among their ranks. The march with the Red Army was unlike anything Joseph had known. The soldiers eyed him with suspicion, whispering behind his back. Some laughed at his accent, others touched his ragged uniform as if to test whether it was real. He was fed a tin of buckwheat porridge, thicker and richer than anything he had eaten in months, and the warmth nearly brought tears to his eyes. Yet with every spoonful he felt the weight of their stares. He was not one of them. He was a stranger, a foreign body in their living organism of war. That night, by the campfire, the officer approached again. He squatted across from Joseph, the firelight flickering on his stern features. Through the translator, he asked the question Joseph had dreaded. "Why should we trust you?" Joseph met his gaze. He had no fancy speeches left, no strength for lies. "Because I have fought the same enemy you fight," he said simply. "Because I bled in their prisons. Because I do not want to die in chains. I want to fight." The officer studied him in silence, then finally gave a small nod. He handed Joseph a Soviet cap, its red star catching the firelight. The gesture was not friendship. It was a test, a symbol that for now Joseph was permitted to exist among them. As he pulled the cap onto his head, Joseph felt the strange weight of two worlds colliding. He was still an American paratrooper, his heart loyal to his own flag, but now he marched beneath a different banner, a stranger in a strange uniform. He had become something no other soldier had ever been, an American, fighting at the side of the Red Army. The road ahead was still long, filled with mistrust, hardship, and battle. But in that moment, Joseph Beyrle knew he had crossed a threshold. He had survived captivity, hunger, chains, and despair. Now he would face a new trial, proving himself not just to his captors turned comrades, but to history itself. Joseph's first days with the Red Army were like walking a tightrope over a chasm. Every glance he received from the soldiers carried both curiosity and mistrust. Around the campfires, whispers circled like smoke: spy, deserter, liar. Some said no American would ever survive the camps. Others muttered that he must have been planted by the Germans to infiltrate their unit. The officer who had taken responsibility for him, a grizzled major with sharp gray eyes, kept Joseph close, watching his every move. He did not smile, did not offer words of comfort, but neither did he condemn the stranger. The major seemed to believe in a principle Joseph had learned himself through hardship. Men are revealed not by their words, but by their actions. So Joseph waited for his chance to prove himself. That chance came sooner than expected. One bitter morning, as frost clung to the earth and fog curled through the birches, the order came down. They were to move eastward, closer to the front. The Red Army's armor, battered but relentless, rumbled forward. The column of tanks was a living beast. Steel tracks grinding, engines growling, exhaust choking the air. Joseph had seen tanks before, but never like this. dozens of them, scarred by battles yet still alive, pushing forward with unstoppable force. The soldiers laughed when Joseph tried to keep pace on foot. His boots were torn, his legs weak from months of malnutrition. After an hour, he stumbled into the mud, gasping. One of the tank commanders, a burly man with a blackened face from engine soot, barked something at him. The translator chuckled. "He says, 'You cannot even walk. How will you fight?'" The men around the tank roared with laughter. Joseph forced himself upright, blood pounding in his ears, shame burning his cheeks. The major, however, silenced them with a gesture. He studied Joseph, then pointed to the open hatch of a tank. "Inside," the translator said, "if you want to prove you ride with them." The crew inside the tank greeted Joseph with suspicion. The interior was cramped, suffocating, stinking of oil, sweat, and cordite. He slid into the gunner's seat, trying to make himself small, his hands brushing against cold metal. The Russian voices around him were harsh and quick, full of slang he could not understand. Yet he recognized the rhythm. The same rhythm of soldiers everywhere, men who had lived too long in war and no longer needed words to communicate. At first, they treated him as extra baggage. They shoved a ration tin into his hands and left him in the corner while they worked. But Joseph was a paratrooper, adaptable, quick to learn. He studied every movement, how the loader rammed shells into the breech, how the commander scanned the terrain through the hatch, how the driver listened to the engine as if to the heartbeat of a horse. When the first skirmish came, Joseph's chance arrived. German troops had ambushed the column from a wooded ridge. Mortars rained down. Machine gun fire clattered. The tank lurched as the driver swerved. The gunner cursed, struggling to line up a shot when shrapnel struck him across the forehead. Blood streamed down his face, and he slumped unconscious. For a heartbeat, the crew froze. The loader shouted. The commander roared. But the gunner could not continue. Then Joseph moved. Without waiting for orders, he slid into the seat, his hands instinctively finding the controls. Training in the American Army was different. The weapons not the same, but principles were universal. He peered through the scope, saw the German position outlined against the tree line, and fired. The cannon thundered. The shell streaked across the battlefield and exploded in the nest of machine guns. Smoke and fire blossomed. The commander jerked his head, astonished, then barked for another round. Joseph reloaded with the help of the loader, adjusted, fired again. Another explosion tore through the German ridge. The battle was over quickly after that. The enemy scattered, broken by the armored assault. The tank crew sat in silence for a moment, breathing heavily in the smoke-filled interior. Then, slowly, the commander clapped Joseph on the shoulder, a grunt of approval. Another soldier laughed, short and rough, but not mocking this time. Word spread quickly through the column. The American could fight, and not only fight, but fight like one of them. Suspicion did not vanish overnight. It clung like smoke, but trust began to grow. They no longer called him Spion in hushed tones. Now they called him Tankist. That evening, sitting on the steel hull of the tank, under a sky streaked with fire from the distant front, Joseph realized something profound. He had crossed yet another invisible border. He was no longer just a prisoner who had stumbled into their ranks. He was a soldier again, part of a crew, part of the relentless machine grinding its way toward Berlin. In a foreign tongue, in a foreign uniform, Joseph Beyrle had been reborn as a tanker of the Red Army. The dawn came red over the horizon, a blood-colored haze spilling across the Polish fields. Frost clung to the grass, brittle and shining, but the ground trembled under the weight of engines already awake. The Red Army was preparing for an assault, and Joseph found himself strapped inside the belly of steel that had become his new world. The tank shook with every rev of the motor, as if impatient to leap forward. He sat in the gunner's seat again, the place he had claimed by necessity and earned by fire. Around him, the crew moved with practiced rhythm. The loader, broad-shouldered and grim, slammed shells into the breech with arms of iron. The driver muttered prayers through clenched teeth, one hand on a lucky charm dangling from a bolt. Above them, the commander stood half out of the hatch, binoculars pressed to his face, barking orders in rapid Russian. Joseph caught only fragments, but he understood enough. They were going in hard, and they were going in fast. Outside, dozens of tanks lined up like wolves ready to pounce. Their exhaust poured clouds of smoke into the air, mixing with the fog so that the entire column looked like some monstrous dragon with many heads. Infantry clung to the sides, faces set, rifles tight against their chests. Behind them, artillery thundered a preparation barrage, the earth convulsing as shells tore into the German positions. The air smelled of cordite and oil, of burning and waiting. The commander slammed his fist against Joseph's shoulder, his signal. Joseph pressed his eye to the scope. Through the shifting haze, he saw the outlines of a village ahead, fortified with machine gun nests, sandbags, and the long, dark barrels of anti-tank guns hidden at the edges of barns. The Germans were ready, but so were the Soviets. The order came. Engines roared. The tanks surged forward as one. The ground quaked, mud splattering, tracks grinding like the jaws of a giant. Joseph's heart hammered in his chest, yet his hands were steady. He had dreamed of this moment during endless nights in captivity, to strike back, to fight not as prey, but as hunter. The first shots came from the ridge. German shells screamed overhead, exploding in the fields, geysers of dirt and fire erupting. One Soviet tank burst into flames, its turret blown skyward in a thunderclap. The crew inside had no chance. Joseph clenched his jaw and focused. The commander shouted, the loader rammed a shell, and Joseph fired. The cannon thundered, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. Through the smoke, he saw his shot hit true. The German gun pit exploded, its crew scattering like rag dolls. The tank lurched forward. Bullets pinged against the armor like hail. Another shell, another target, another roar. Each time Joseph fired, the crew around him barked approval, their suspicion melting into raw trust. He was one of them now, bound by the same deafening rhythm of death and survival. The Soviet column pushed into the village. Houses burned, walls crumbled, streets turned into rivers of smoke and rubble. Joseph glimpsed German soldiers fleeing, their helmets flashing as they darted through alleyways. Others stood their ground, pouring fire into the advancing armor. But the weight of steel was unstoppable. Soviet tanks rolled over barricades, crushed machine gun nests beneath their tracks, spewed fire into the ruins. Inside the tank it was chaos. Heat, smoke, the stink of gunpowder. Joseph's ears rang. His chest rattled with every shot. But his vision narrowed to the scope, to the next target, to survival. He thought of Normandy, of how he had fallen into the jaws of fate there, and now here he was, in the heart of Poland, fighting under a red star. The irony did not matter. Only the battle did. Hours later, when the guns fell silent and the village lay broken, Joseph climbed out of the hatch. His face was blackened with soot, his ears still buzzing, his hands trembling, though he refused to show it. Around him, Soviet soldiers cheered, embraced one another, some laughing, some weeping. Smoke rose from the ruins like ghosts. Victory had a bitter taste, but it was victory nonetheless. The commander pulled Joseph close, a rare smile cracking his weathered face. He spoke words Joseph barely understood, but the meaning was clear. You fought like one of us. For the first time since Normandy, Joseph felt not just alive, but part of something greater. He was still an American, still a stranger in a foreign uniform. But on that day, riding in a Soviet tank through fire and ruin, he became a brother among warriors. The victory in the village brought no pause, no chance to breathe. The Red Army never lingered. Momentum was everything. The Germans were retreating, but they retreated like wolves, teeth bared, leaving traps behind. The Soviet tanks pushed on deeper into occupied land, and Joseph discovered that war with them was not only about head-on battles. It was also about relentless raids, about cutting the enemy's veins so he could not strike again. The orders came in the gray chill of dawn. A railway bridge, still in German hands, had to be destroyed before reinforcements arrived. A fuel depot, hidden in a forest clearing, was to be reduced to ash. There would be no rest for the men, no warmth beyond the heat of burning supplies. Joseph, the American-turned-tankist, was thrown into this grinding rhythm without hesitation. The column moved like a predator through the night. Engines were muffled, voices kept low. When they reached the bridge, moonlight gleamed off the steel structure, silent and defiant over the black river. German guards paced along it, rifles slung carelessly. They did not expect tanks. The Soviets struck with precision. Infantry swarmed from the shadows, knives and submachine guns whispering death in the dark. Within minutes, the guards were down, and sappers rushed forward, satchels of explosives strapped to their backs. Joseph watched from the tank hatch as the charges were laid. The men worked fast, their faces pale in the moonlight, sweat glistening despite the cold. The Germans realized too late. Searchlights flared, bullets cracked, shouts erupted. Joseph dropped back into the turret, lined up the scope, and fired. The first shell blasted the searchlight to shards. The second tore through a machine gun nest. The bridge shook as explosions rippled across its length. With a final thunderous roar, the steel skeleton folded, collapsing into the river below. The current swallowed it, and with it any hope of the enemy's reinforcements. But the war did not end with one victory. By the next night, Joseph found himself in the forest, the tank creeping forward like some great beast among the trees. The target, a German fuel depot hidden beneath camouflaged netting. Barrels upon barrels of gasoline and oil lay stacked, guarded by troops who smoked and laughed, unaware that doom was already upon them. The attack began with a single shot. Joseph's cannon roared, and the first barrel exploded in a fountain of fire. In seconds, the night turned into day. Flames devoured the depot, leaping skyward, spreading faster than men could flee. Germans ran screaming, their shadows huge and frantic against the inferno. Soviet infantry poured forward, cutting down survivors, securing the perimeter. The air stank of burning oil, so thick Joseph could taste it on his tongue. The fire raged for hours. a column of black smoke rising to mark the destruction. By morning, the tanks were already moving again. There was no rest, no celebration. For every bridge destroyed, another stood ahead. For every depot burned, the Germans built two more. Joseph's body ached. His ears never stopped ringing. His eyes burned from smoke and sleepless nights. Yet the Red Army marched, and he marched with them. It was a war without rest, a war that did not allow a man to think too long about home or about what he had lost. A war that demanded everything, every ounce of strength, every heartbeat, every fragment of will. Joseph had become part of it now, not as a prisoner, not as an outsider, but as one more soldier in the endless tide rolling westward. And though exhaustion gnawed at him, one thought kept him alive. Each bridge destroyed, each depot burned, each battle won, carried him one step closer to the end of the nightmare, and perhaps, if God willed it, to home. The march westward became an endless blur of smoke, fire, and iron. For weeks, Joseph had lived inside the belly of the tank, where every day meant another battle, another bridge, another German stronghold turned to rubble. He had grown used to the roar of the cannon, the deafening clang of shells, the suffocating stench of diesel and gunpowder. But even hardened men could not escape the truth of war. Death was always just one heartbeat away. It happened on a bleak winter morning. Snow covered the fields in a thin crust, muffling sound, hiding dangers. The column moved cautiously, knowing German resistance was near. The village ahead seemed quiet, too quiet, its chimneys cold, its streets deserted. Joseph sat at his scope, eyes scanning every shadow. Then the first shot came. The explosion tore through the lead tank, a fireball of steel and men. Screams followed, and immediately the world turned into chaos. Anti-tank guns hidden in barns opened fire. German soldiers burst from cellars, weapons blazing. The Soviet column split into action, tanks swinging their turrets, infantry diving for cover. Joseph lined up the scope and fired once, twice, each shot blasting apart an enemy position. Then the world slammed into him, a deafening crack, a shudder that rattled every bone. An armor-piercing shell struck his tank. The interior erupted with sparks and smoke. Metal fragments sliced through the air. Joseph felt searing pain in his side, as though a white-hot iron had been driven through him. He fell from the gunner's seat, clutching his ribs, his vision swimming in red. The crew shouted, their voices frantic, but their work did not stop. The driver kept the tank moving. The commander roared orders. The loader fought to ram shells into the breach despite the fire and blood. Joseph tried to rise, tried to reach the scope again, but his body betrayed him. Every breath stabbed like a knife. He tasted copper in his mouth and knew blood was filling his lungs. The battle raged on, but for Joseph, time slowed. He saw the faces of his comrades lit by flashes of fire, grim, determined, alive. He realized then how close he was to losing all of it. The darkness pressed in, the noise became a distant hum, and for a moment he wondered if this was the end. When he awoke, it was not the battlefield but a hospital tent that surrounded him. Canvas walls flapped in the winter wind, kerosene lamps flickered, and the air reeked of disinfectant, blood, and smoke. Rows of wounded men lay on stretchers, their groans filling the dim space. Nurses in gray uniforms moved swiftly, their hands steady despite the chaos. Joseph tried to sit up, but pain pinned him down. A bandage wrapped his chest tight, stained with dark red. A Russian nurse pushed him gently back. She spoke in soft words he barely understood, but her eyes told him enough. He was alive, but only just. Days blurred together. Fever gripped him, dragging him into nightmares of barbed wire, burning bridges, and faces he could not save. At times, he woke to the sound of boots and the thunder of distant artillery, reminders that the war did not pause for broken men. At other times, he opened his eyes to see the nurse still there, quietly tending to his wounds, whispering that he was strong, stronger than most. For the first time in years, Joseph was forced into stillness. No battles, no tanks, no running, only breath after breath, each one a small victory. He realized how fragile life truly was, how easily the line between living and dying could be erased by a single shell, a single shard of steel. Yet he also knew this. Death had brushed him, but it had not claimed him, and as long as his heart still beat, he would rise again. The war was not done with him, and he was not done with the war. The hospital days dragged like winter shadows, but Joseph's body healed with stubborn resilience. The Soviet doctors had not expected the foreigner to survive. The shrapnel had torn deep, grazing his lung, but he had endured worse already. Weeks later, pale and thinner than ever, he stood once more on his own feet. The major, who had once doubted him, now clasped his shoulder with rough pride. Orders had arrived. Joseph was to be sent not back to the front, but to Moscow. The journey was surreal. Instead of rattling cattle cars and forced marches, Joseph now traveled in a military train. Outside the frost-streaked windows, Russia passed by in endless stretches. Villages with crooked fences, vast forests black against the snow, rivers frozen into silence. Wherever the train stopped, crowds gathered to see the strange soldier in patched American uniform and Soviet cap. Some whispered in disbelief, others offered him bread, apples, or shy smiles. For them, he was living proof that their struggle was shared by faraway allies. When he finally arrived in Moscow, the city stunned him. After months of ruins and burned villages, here stood wide boulevards, proud buildings, and lights that defied the blackout. The Kremlin's towers pierced the winter sky, their red stars glowing like fire against the frost. Despite rationing and hardship, Moscow lived, breathed, resisted, and Joseph, an American paratrooper who had fallen into the jaws of fate, now walked at its heart. His reception was more than he could have imagined. Soviet officials, grim but respectful, asked for his story. Translators worked tirelessly as he recounted D-Day, his capture, his escapes, his battles with Soviet tankers. Generals listened with furrowed brows, sometimes nodding, sometimes exchanging sharp whispers. Then came something unexpected. Applause. The room, full of hardened officers, clapped for the lone American who had bled on their soil. Word spread quickly. Newspapers printed his story, calling him the American who fought under the red banner. Reporters sketched his likeness, emphasizing his rugged face, his eyes that carried both exhaustion and fire. Soviet soldiers on leave recognized him in the streets and saluted. Children pointed, whispering that here walked a man who had fought both under the stars and stripes and under the red star of the East. Joseph, who only months earlier had lain in the mud, convinced he would die nameless in a camp, now stood in the halls of Moscow as a symbol of unity. He felt the weight of it. More than a man, he had become a bridge between two worlds that barely trusted each other. The most memorable moment came when he was invited into a hall draped with crimson banners. Officers in decorated uniforms lined the walls. Joseph was presented not as a prisoner or a guest, but as a comrade in arms. The ceremony was simple yet solemn, a recognition of the man who had crossed borders, languages, and armies to keep fighting the same enemy. As he stood before them, the thought struck him like a bolt. He was the only one. No other American had ever fought officially in both armies. No one else had worn two uniforms, sworn loyalty to two flags, and lived to tell of it. History had placed him in a position no man could ever plan, and perhaps no one would ever repeat. That night, walking through the snow-covered streets of Moscow, Joseph looked up at the glowing Kremlin stars. He thought of home, of Michigan fields, of his mother's prayers, of the brothers who might not even know if he was alive. Yet here, in the heart of the Soviet Union, he had been given something priceless: recognition, dignity, and the knowledge that his suffering had not been in vain. He was still an outsider, yes, but no longer a stranger. Moscow had accepted him, not as a foreign curiosity, but as a soldier who had fought and bled on the same road to victory. For Joseph Beyrle, it was a moment of belonging, unlike any other, a fleeting glimpse of honor in a war that had nearly devoured him. The train that carried Joseph out of Moscow rolled westward, past frozen plains, across rivers that still bore the scars of battle, through cities where ruins smoked beside the first signs of rebuilding. His journey back to America felt unreal. He had lived so long as a shadow, prisoner, fugitive, stranger in a foreign uniform, that the thought of home seemed like a dream he had once had as a boy. Through Poland and into Allied-held territory, his passage was arranged by both Soviet and American officials. Everywhere he stopped, people stared. Who was this gaunt man in an American jacket with a Soviet star tucked into his bag? He was offered food, coffee, even whiskey by Allied soldiers who listened in disbelief as he recounted fragments of his story. Some laughed, assuming he exaggerated. Others simply shook their heads. When Joseph finally stepped onto American soil again, it was not with parades or fanfare. He arrived quietly, a soldier returned from the dead. In official records, he had been listed as killed in action since Normandy. His family in Michigan had mourned him, prayed for him, grieved his absence for nearly 2 years. Now, suddenly, he was alive, standing before them in flesh and blood. The moment of reunion was seared into his memory forever. His mother opened the door, her hands still dusted with flour from the kitchen. For a heartbeat, she stared at him, her mind refusing to believe what her eyes saw. Then she gasped, her knees buckled, and tears poured down her face. Joseph was all she could say, the name trembling on her lips, as if she were afraid the vision might vanish. Neighbors gathered, word spreading like fire through the small town. The boy who died has come home. Old friends, veterans, even strangers came to see him, each repeating the same phrase, "We thought you were gone. We thought we'd never see you again." Joseph smiled, but behind his eyes lingered the weight of everything he had endured. In the weeks that followed, he was summoned to military offices, asked to tell his story again and again. Officers scribbled notes, astonished at the details. Captured in France, imprisoned in Poland, escaped twice, fought with Soviet tank crews, wounded, honored in Moscow. It sounded impossible, a tale fit for novels. not for official reports. Some men in pressed uniforms doubted him outright. But Joseph bore scars no imagination could invent, and Soviet documents confirmed the truth. Slowly, the Army accepted the impossible, that one of their paratroopers had fought in two armies in the same war. Yet, what struck Joseph most was not the disbelief of officials, but the quiet wonder of ordinary Americans. In bars, at church, on street corners, people shook his hand and asked, "What was it like? How did you survive?" He could never explain it fully. How could anyone who had not lived through the wire, the hunger, the tank battles truly understand? He told fragments, simple truths. It was hell, but I had to keep going. At night, when the house was quiet, Joseph sometimes stared at the ceiling and thought of Moscow, the comrades he had left behind, the tank crew who had treated him as one of their own. He thought of the men who had not survived, their names carved into his memory like gravestones. He felt both pride and sorrow. He was alive, yes, but so many were not. The newspapers eventually ran his story, calling him the man who fought under two flags. Journalists came with cameras, their flashes freezing his weary smile. Headlines marveled at the American who became a Soviet tankist. For his family, for his town, it was a miracle. For Joseph, it was simply the end of a long, brutal road. And yet, as he walked through familiar fields in Michigan, hearing the wind rustle the corn the way it had when he was a boy, Joseph felt something deeper. He was no longer just a soldier who had survived. He was a bridge between worlds, proof that even in the darkest war, men from opposite sides of the earth could fight as brothers. No one could believe their eyes when he returned, but Joseph himself could hardly believe it either. Life had given him back what war had nearly stolen, the chance to live, to love, to remember, and above all, to carry the story of the impossible journey he had made, from Normandy to Moscow, from captivity to freedom, from death to life. Years after the guns fell silent, long after the smoke of war had cleared, Joseph's story remained unlike any other. In Normandy, he had leapt into darkness under the stars and stripes, and in Poland he had fought beneath the red banner. Two armies, two nations, two worlds that trusted one another only cautiously, yet in his life, in his blood, they had come together. He became a living emblem of something larger than himself, the fragile but undeniable union that had broken the back of fascism. Where diplomats argued and generals distrusted, Joseph had shown what brotherhood looked like in the mud, in the steel of tanks, in the roar of cannons. For him, the alliance was not a political arrangement. It was the grip of a Soviet comrade's hand pulling him out of the turret. The crust of bread shared on a frozen night, the salute offered in Moscow's heart to a foreign soldier who had refused to give up. Back home, people often asked him which army he truly belonged to. His answer was always the same. I fought where I had to fight. I fought with those who stood against tyranny. To him, the banners were not in conflict. The American flag was the soil of his birth, the family who had mourned and then welcomed him home. The Soviet flag was the fire of his survival, the blood and sweat of strangers who had become brothers in arms. Two banners, one soldier. Time passed, and nations drifted apart into suspicion and rivalry. The Cold War hardened borders that Joseph had once crossed in trust. Yet even then, his life stood as a reminder of what had once been possible. In ceremonies, He was honored by both sides, welcomed in Moscow as a comrade, embraced in Washington as a patriot. Few men could walk in both halls and be recognized without contradiction. Joseph did, because his story belonged not to politics, but to humanity. As years turned into decades, Joseph often spoke not of his wounds or his suffering, but of the unity he had witnessed. He remembered the Soviet crew who had laughed when he first climbed into their tank and who had later trusted him with their lives. He remembered his mother's tears when he returned home, the disbelief in his neighbor's eyes, the way children whispered that he was living proof miracles existed. History books would call him unique. Soldiers would call him brother. Survivors of the camps would call him one of their own. And Joseph himself would simply say that he was lucky, that fate had spared him when so many others had been lost. In the end, his life stood as a symbol of a truth carved in steel and fire. When men fight side by side against evil, their flags do not matter. What matters is courage, endurance, and the will to never surrender. Two banners, one soldier, and through him, for a brief moment in history, the world remembered what unity could achieve. Years after the guns had fallen silent, Joseph Beyrle carried the war not only in the scars on his body, but in the shadows of his memory. He had returned home, built a life, raised children, yet the war never truly let him go. It lived in his mind like a series of reels that could be unspooled at any moment. The jump into Normandy's night, the hunger in the camps, the thunder inside a Soviet tank, the glow of Moscow's red stars. At first, he rarely spoke of it. In the quiet towns of America, people wanted victory parades, medals, stories of triumph. They did not want the smell of burning oil, the endless hunger, or the weight of comrades dying in silence. Joseph would sit at community gatherings, listen to others tell tales of their service, and nod quietly. He smiled, but behind his eyes, the past replayed in painful detail. It was only later, when the years had softened the immediacy of war but sharpened its lessons, that he began to share his story. Veterans groups invited him to speak. Schools asked him to tell children about the war. At first, he stumbled, unsure where to begin, but as he spoke, he realized that his memory itself was a battlefield, one he had to cross carefully, truth by truth. He told them about Normandy, the drop into darkness, the shock of capture. He spoke of the camps in Poland, of the hopelessness that ate men alive even before hunger did. He described the escape attempts, the punishments, the feeling of death breathing down his neck. And then, with a mixture of pride and disbelief, he told of the Red Army tankers who had given him a place, of the battles fought under a flag that was never his but became part of his life. Audiences listened in awe. Teachers wiped their eyes. Children stared wide-eyed. Veterans nodded with the recognition of shared pain. Some asked if he exaggerated. How could one man live through all of that? Joseph never raised his voice, never sought glory. He simply said, "I was there. I survived. That's all." Memory was not easy. At night, after these talks, the past returned sharper than before. Dreams dragged him back to the barracks stinking of lice, to the roar of cannons, to the sight of men fallen beside him. Sometimes he woke drenched in sweat, his chest aching, as if the shrapnel still burned inside. Speaking of the war had freed the story, but it also freed the ghosts. And yet, Joseph endured that trial willingly. He believed the story was not his alone. It belonged to history, to the men who never came back, to the bond between two armies that had once stood together against darkness. By telling it, he gave voice to those who could no longer speak. In his later years, when he was invited to Moscow once more, he stood again in the Kremlin. Russian veterans clasped his hands, their eyes shining with tears. In Washington, officials shook his hand and called him a patriot. Joseph smiled at the irony. Once a prisoner, once a stranger in a strange uniform, now honored on both sides of a world divided. But when people asked him what he remembered most, he did not speak of ceremonies or medals. He spoke of comrades, of the American paratroopers who leapt with him into the night, of the Soviet tankers who shared their bread, of the nameless prisoners whose whispers kept hope alive in the dark. His memory was not just of battles, but of faces, a bond forged in fire. For Joseph Beyrle, memory was not only a burden, it was also a duty. The trial of memory was endless, but he bore it with the same resolve with which he had once borne captivity, hunger, and war. And through his voice, the impossible journey of one soldier, an American under two banners, would never be forgotten. Time carried Joseph Beyrle far from the roar of cannons and the iron jaws of tanks. He grew old in peace, a life once denied him by the war. Yet even as decades passed, the memory of his journey never faded. To those who knew his story, he was not only a veteran, he was a man of two armies, a soldier who had carried two banners on his shoulders and survived to tell the tale. History often divides nations, carves borders, raises flags against one another, but Joseph's life became proof that beyond politics, beyond suspicion, men could find brotherhood in battle. He had jumped into Normandy as an American paratrooper, been chained in German camps as a prisoner of war, and fought inside a Soviet tank as a brother among strangers. Each chapter of his life could have ended in silence, yet together they formed a story so improbable it seemed like legend. In Moscow, he was remembered as the only American who had officially fought under the red banner. In Washington, he was honored as a paratrooper who had endured beyond all expectation. His name bridged two nations that later became rivals. During ceremonies, when Russian and American veterans stood side by side, Joseph's story was often invoked as a symbol of what unity could achieve. Children in schools listened wide-eyed when told about the man who escaped death more times than fate seemed to allow. Journalists called him a soldier of two worlds. Fellow veterans, hardened by their own battles, nodded in respect, understanding that no medal could fully capture the weight of his survival. But Joseph himself never claimed greatness. When asked how he endured, he simply said, "I did what any man would do. I fought to live, and I fought to win." His humility was as much a part of his legacy as his courage. When at last his life's journey came to an end, Joseph was laid to rest in the soil of his homeland. Yet his story did not die with him. It lives on in books, in museums, in the memories of those who cherish the fragile alliance that once bound two mighty nations together. His life is recounted as both history and parable, a lesson in resilience, a reminder of shared humanity, a call to remember that even in the darkest war, unity can be born. The banners he once bore now rest folded in glass cases, one starred, one red, but together they tell a story that no passage of time can erase. Joseph Beyrle, the man of two armies, left behind more than memories. He left a legacy that lives forever, carved in steel, blood, and the unbreakable will of a soldier who refused to surrender.